The world just entered a moment of explosive escalation that almost no one is talking about, and the implications are terrifying. In the last 72 hours, fresh high-resolution satellite imagery has revealed that Iran is actively repairing ballistic missile infrastructure that was heavily damaged in last year's Middle East conflict. These aren't empty hangars or storage lots. We're talking about repair and reactivation work at multiple missile production and launch sites, including ones hit during heavy Israeli and U.S. strikes in June 2025, like Shahroud and Parchin. The hurried reconstruction is unmistakable. Earth movers, new roofing structures, and cleared debris all indicate rapid rebuilding, even while major nuclear facilities remain partially concealed or buried. This activity comes at the very moment that former U.S. President Donald Trump is publicly pushing renewed diplomatic engagement with Tehran, including discussions held recently in Oman and private U.S. Iran channels focusing on a potential agreement. Trump's public messaging emphasizes that talks are ongoing and that there's still a chance to reach a constructive framework, even as tensions remain near crisis levels. But what's happening on the ground in Iran suggests two stark realities. Tehran is preparing for escalation, not demobilization, and its missile infrastructure is being prioritized over its visible nuclear sites. For weeks, analysts have monitored limited activity at major nuclear complexes like Natanz and Isfahan, where damaged buildings have been covered with new roofs and tunnel entrances have been deliberately buried under fill dirt, a move experts interpret as preparations for defense against a possible U.S. or Israeli strike, not resumption of peaceful work. These actions imply that Iran is protecting what's left of its nuclear infrastructure in anticipation of potential military action, rather than dismantling or abandoning it. Simultaneously, Iran has made it explicit in the most definitive language yet that its missile program will not be negotiable. On February 11, 2026, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader publicly declared that ballistic missile capabilities are a red line, that Tehran will never submit to restrictions. That statement was delivered at a massive anniversary march for the Islamic Revolution and signals a deeper strategic shift. Iran will talk about nuclear limits if sanctions are eased, but missiles are off the table. Putting these pieces together reveals a calculation few commentators are willing to state out loud. Tehran is positioning itself for a future in which it retains and rebuilds its long-range strike capability at the same time it negotiates on nuclear constraints. The rapid reconstruction of missile facilities, even when key production equipment like solid fuel mixers might still be missing, shows that the regime is determined to restore at least part of its strategic deterrence after last year's blows. Meanwhile, U.S. policymakers are facing pressure from all sides, Trump emphasizing diplomacy, Gulf allies warning of Iran's missile threat, and Israel pushing Washington to include missiles and regional proxies in any package. Despite these diplomatic pushes, Iran's public messaging is unambiguous. Missile capabilities will remain intact, and any deal that tries to touch them will be rejected out of hand. So let's be clear about the scale of what's happening now. Iranian ballistic missile sites, many of which were catastrophic wrecks just months ago, are being rebuilt. Civil nuclear facilities that were once at the center of global negotiations are being sealed and buried, a defensive move, not a sign of compliance. And American leadership publicly claims negotiations are alive, even as Tehran makes non-negotiable demands. This isn't distant geopolitics. This is a ticking reckoning, missile capacity restored, nuclear infrastructure protected, and diplomatic overtures unfolding against a backdrop of real, observable military, industrial activity. Viewers should understand, the narrative of diplomacy succeeding and the reality of Iran rearming are happening at exactly the same time, and neither side is slowing down. Here is Chapter 2, 600 words long paragraphs tightly structured, based only on the most recent verified developments and current geopolitical positioning. What we are witnessing did not happen overnight. The current standoff is the product of decisions made in just the last 18 months, and each one narrowed the path toward de-escalation. After the massive exchange of strikes between Israel and Iran in mid-2025, Iranian military planners began reassessing their vulnerability. Satellite assessments published in late 2025 showed that several surface-level missile production facilities were far more exposed than Tehran had calculated. The lesson was immediate: harden, disperse, rebuild. By late 2025, Western intelligence agencies were already reporting that Iran had accelerated underground construction projects near known missile complexes. By early 2026, commercial imagery confirmed what analysts suspected: damaged ballistic missile infrastructure was being reconstructed at speed, while key components were being relocated or shielded. At the same time, nuclear diplomacy entered a fragile new phase. Indirect U.S. Iran contacts resumed in late 2025 through regional intermediaries, including Oman and Qatar. Public messaging from Washington signaled that exploratory talks were ongoing, but Tehran's posture hardened in parallel. On February 11, 2026, during official anniversary events marking the 1979 revolution, senior Iranian leadership made it explicit that ballistic missile capabilities are non-negotiable. That declaration was not rhetorical theater, it was strategic positioning before any formal diplomatic framework takes shape. By carving missiles out of negotiations before talks even solidify, Tehran is setting the ceiling on concessions in advance. Meanwhile, the nuclear file itself has grown more complicated, not less. The International Atomic Energy Agency's most recent reporting confirms that Iran continues to enrich uranium well beyond the limits established under the 2015 agreement. Stockpiles of uranium enriched to 60% purity remain in place, a level technically below weapons grade but dramatically closer than the 3.67% cap under the original deal. Inspectors still have access to declared facilities, but the monitoring regime is thinner than it was prior to February 2021, when Iran curtailed additional transparency measures. That reduced visibility creates a narrower margin for miscalculation. The international community is effectively negotiating without the inspection leverage it once had. There is another structural shift that often goes unmentioned: regional power alignment. Since 2022, Iran has deepened military coordination with Russia, particularly through drone transfers and defense cooperation. That relationship has altered Iran's strategic calculus. Tehran no longer sees itself as diplomatically isolated in the way it did during earlier sanction cycles. Simultaneously, Gulf states have pursued their own hedging strategies, balancing security cooperation with Washington while reopening diplomatic channels with Tehran. Saudi-Iran normalization talks in recent years reduced immediate regional tension, but they did not eliminate long-term strategic rivalry. That balance of caution and distrust defines the current landscape. Inside Washington, the debate is equally complex. Advocates of renewed negotiations argue that freezing enrichment levels is better than allowing continued acceleration. Critics argue that entering talks while missile sites are visibly being rebuilt weakens leverage. The tension between urgency and deterrence defines this moment. Sanctions remain in place, but enforcement gaps have appeared, particularly in oil shipments routed through intermediaries. Iran's crude exports rebounded modestly in late 2025 compared to previous lows, providing the regime with limited but meaningful economic breathing room. That revenue stabilizes internal pressure just enough to maintain strategic patience. What makes this phase uniquely volatile is that both sides appear to be preparing for opposite outcomes simultaneously. Tehran is fortifying infrastructure as if escalation is possible. Washington is signaling diplomacy as if stabilization is achievable. Neither posture cancels the other out. Instead, they coexist. And when preparation for confrontation and preparation for negotiation happen in parallel, the margin for error shrinks dramatically. The system is no longer in a pause, it is in motion on two tracks at once, and those tracks are not aligned. Here is Chapter 3, 600 words, long structured paragraphs, grounded in the most recent verified developments and current 2026 conditions, no filler. The rebuilding of missile infrastructure and the acceleration of nuclear positioning are not isolated military maneuvers. They are reshaping economic stability, regional security, and daily life across multiple countries right now. Since late 2025, oil markets have reacted sharply to every verified report of Iranian reconstruction activity and every diplomatic signal from Washington. Brent crude has repeatedly moved above the mid-$90 range during periods of heightened tension, reflecting how fragile energy flows remain in a region that handles roughly 1/5 of global petroleum supply through the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Gulf have climbed in response to elevated threat assessments issued by maritime security monitors, and shipping firms have quietly adjusted routes and contingency plans. Energy traders are no longer pricing in calm, they are pricing in risk. Inside Iran, the economic consequences of prolonged sanctions combined with military rebuilding efforts are visible. Inflation remains structurally high, with consumer goods and imported medical supplies under constant pricing pressure due to currency weakness and restricted financial channels. The Iranian rial continues to trade at deeply depreciated levels on the open market compared to official rates, widening the gap between state-controlled narratives and household reality. While oil exports have modestly improved compared to earlier sanction lows, much of that trade moves through discounted channels, limiting fiscal recovery. Military reconstruction projects, including missile site repair and underground fortification, require resources, labor, and material, all of which compete with domestic economic priorities. The regime frames these expenditures as national security imperatives. Citizens experience them as continued economic strain. Beyond Iran's borders, regional defense postures are actively shifting. Israel has maintained heightened alert levels since the direct missile and drone exchange of 2024, and the subsequent escalation cycle that carried into 2025. Air defense systems remain reinforced, and military planners continue preparing for rapid response contingencies. Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have increased investment in missile interception and early warning systems, coordinating closely with U.S. Central Command. Defense budgets across the region reflect a shared assumption: the risk of miscalculation has not disappeared. It has intensified. The United States also feels the impact domestically. Energy price volatility directly affects fuel costs, transportation expenses, and broader inflation sensitivity. Each surge in crude markets places pressure on global supply chains already balancing post-pandemic normalization and geopolitical instability. Strategic petroleum reserve policy remains politically sensitive, particularly in an election-driven environment where gasoline prices can shift public sentiment quickly. Diplomatic negotiations with Iran are therefore not just foreign policy calculations, they intersect with domestic economic optics. There is also the security spillover effect. Iranian-aligned regional groups in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen remain active, and while large-scale coordinated escalation has not occurred in early 2026, low-intensity exchanges continue to test red lines. Maritime incidents, drone interceptions, and proxy signaling keep the environment unstable without tipping into open regional war. This gray zone pressure maintains leverage for Tehran while avoiding direct conventional confrontation. It is calibrated tension, but tension nonetheless. For ordinary people across the region, the instability is not theoretical. In southern Lebanon and northern Israel, communities remain sensitive to rocket alerts and defensive mobilizations. In Gulf coastal cities, businesses monitor shipping advisories as closely as financial markets. In Iran, families track currency fluctuations and fuel subsidies as indicators of economic survivability. In the United States and Europe, consumers feel energy volatility ripple into everyday expenses. The chain reaction from missile reconstruction to household budgeting is not dramatic on television, but it is measurable. The most striking reality is this: escalation does not require open war to cause damage. Reconstruction of missile sites signals deterrence posture. Enrichment expansion signals leverage, negotiation signals opportunity, but markets respond to risk, not reassurance. And while leaders debate frameworks and red lines, the economic and psychological pressure is already unfolding in real time. The systems affected, energy, security, trade, currency, are interconnected. When one tightens, the others react. The fallout is not coming, it is already in motion. Responsibility for the current escalation does not sit in one capital, but the decisions shaping this moment are traceable, documented, and recent. Tehran chose to publicly declare in February 2026 that its ballistic missile program is non-negotiable even as exploratory diplomatic contacts continued. That statement was not made in isolation. It was delivered during nationally broadcast anniversary events, ensuring both domestic audiences and foreign governments understood the line would not move. At the same time, satellite imagery confirming missile site reconstruction was visible to the world. The sequencing matters. Tehran signaled firmness on missiles while physically rebuilding the very infrastructure under scrutiny. That dual messaging was deliberate. Washington's posture is equally consequential. Signals from Trump's camp in early 2026 emphasize the possibility of a stronger deal than the 2015 framework, but no detailed public framework has been presented outlining how missile limitations would be addressed if Iran has already ruled them out. Critics argue that entering talks without clarity risks repeating the structural gaps of the previous agreement. Supporters counter that freezing enrichment and preventing further nuclear acceleration is the urgent priority, even if missiles are addressed separately. The tension inside U.S. policy circles is real. Secure immediate nuclear constraints or push for a broader package and risk collapse of talks altogether. That strategic fork in the road is not theoretical. It defines every diplomatic signal right now. European governments, which attempted to preserve the original nuclear framework after 2018, are now navigating a narrower space. Monitoring access is weaker than it was prior to 2021. Trust between Tehran and Western capitals is thinner after years of sanctions cycles, proxy confrontations, and direct exchanges. European diplomats continue urging de-escalation, but leverage is limited without unified enforcement or a clear transatlantic framework. Meanwhile, Russia's continued coordination with Iran complicates pressure dynamics. Tehran's defense cooperation with Moscow reduces its isolation and subtly shifts the balance of negotiating power. That geopolitical shift did not exist in 2015. Israel's leadership also plays a central role. After the direct missile and drone exchange cycle of 2024 and the subsequent regional escalation in 2025, Israeli defense planners have maintained a clear red line: Iran cannot approach weaponization capability unchecked. Military readiness remains high, and contingency planning continues. Public messaging from Israeli officials consistently warns that diplomatic agreements must address both nuclear advancement and delivery systems. From Israel's perspective, separating enrichment from missiles creates a partial solution at best. That stance influences Washington's internal debate and raises the stakes of any diplomatic compromise. Inside Iran, decision-making authority ultimately rests with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, whose strategic doctrine emphasizes deterrence and resistance to external pressure. The public refusal to negotiate missile capabilities aligns with long-standing policy positions, but the visible reconstruction adds operational reinforcement to that rhetoric. Iranian officials frame missile rebuilding as defensive necessity following strikes on sovereign territory. Western officials interpret it as preparation that could alter deterrence calculations. The narrative depends on perspective, but the infrastructure is physical fact. What intensifies accountability questions is the overlap of timing. Reconstruction activity became visible while diplomatic channels reopened. Public statements hardened while negotiations were floated. Energy markets reacted while officials reassured stability. Each actor claims to be preventing escalation, yet each action carries escalatory potential. Tehran insists it is strengthening defense. Washington insists it is pursuing stability. Regional actors insist they are protecting security. None of those claims automatically cancel each other out. The uncomfortable truth is that this moment was shaped by cumulative decisions: withdrawal from agreements, incremental enrichment increases, regional strikes, sanctions recalibrations, proxy confrontations, and now reconstruction under negotiation. No single event created this crisis, but specific leaders made specific choices at specific dates that narrowed flexibility. Accountability is not rhetorical, it is structural. And if the next decision misjudges the balance between deterrence and diplomacy, the consequences will not be limited to policy debate. Here is Chapter 5, 600 words long paragraphs forward, looking, grounded in the latest 2026 realities, no fluff, high impact close. What happens next will not unfold slowly. The trajectory being set in early 2026 suggests that the next 12 months could determine whether this crisis stabilizes or accelerates beyond containment. Iran remains a nuclear threshold state, enriching uranium to levels far beyond the original 2015 cap, while maintaining that it has not made a political decision to weaponize. That distinction matters legally, but strategically, the breakout timeline is far shorter than it was a decade ago. With stockpiles of highly enriched uranium already accumulated and advanced centrifuges installed, the technical barrier to further enrichment is measured in weeks, not years. Even if weaponization would take additional time, the perception of capability alone alters regional defense calculations. Perception drives deterrence behavior just as much as confirmed fact. Now add the missile variable. Reconstruction of ballistic missile facilities changes the deterrence equation. Delivery systems are not symbolic, they are the backbone of strategic credibility. If enrichment remains elevated while missile infrastructure is restored and hardened, neighboring states will not wait for formal declarations to adjust their own postures. Saudi Arabia has previously indicated it would not remain passive if Iran approaches nuclear weapon capability. Israel has repeatedly demonstrated willingness to act preemptively when it assesses existential risk. Gulf states continue expanding missile defense systems and security coordination. The result is a region operating on compressed reaction timelines. The margin for diplomatic delay shrinks. Energy markets will respond first to any shock. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most sensitive choke points in the global economy. Even limited disruption, or credible threat of disruption, can spike oil prices within hours. In early 2026, traders are already factoring in risk premiums during every phase of diplomatic uncertainty. If negotiations collapse publicly while missile reconstruction continues, crude markets could react sharply. That would translate into fuel price increases globally, inflationary pressure, and renewed strain on fragile post-pandemic economic stabilization. What begins as a military posture becomes a household expense issue within weeks. There is also the internal Iranian dimension. Economic pressure remains significant, and while oil exports have partially rebounded through alternative channels, sanctions architecture is still intact. If talks fail and enforcement tightens, domestic economic stress will deepen. Historically, Tehran has responded to internal pressure, not by retreating militarily, but by doubling down on deterrence posture. That feedback loop, pressure leading to defiance leading to further pressure, has defined previous cycles. Breaking it requires synchronized diplomatic clarity, not ambiguity. At this moment, ambiguity dominates. For Washington, the calculation is equally high stakes. Entering negotiations while missile capabilities expand risks criticism that leverage is being surrendered. Refusing talks risks accelerating enrichment without constraints. The strategic choice is not between perfect and flawed options. It is between managing risk or confronting it head-on. The difficulty is that both approaches carry visible downsides. The political environment in 2026 only intensifies that tension, as foreign policy decisions intersect directly with domestic economic sensitivity and electoral narratives. The most dangerous scenario is not immediate war, it is gradual normalization of elevated risk. A world where Iran remains permanently near threshold, missile systems fully rebuilt, inspections limited, and diplomacy intermittent but inconclusive. That environment would institutionalize instability rather than resolve it. Markets would adapt, defense budgets would rise, and proxy confrontations would continue at manageable but persistent levels. The crisis would not explode, it would calcify. Everything now hinges on sequencing. If diplomatic frameworks move faster than enrichment expansion and missile fortification, de-escalation remains plausible. If reconstruction and enrichment outpace negotiations, deterrence logic takes over. The infrastructure is being built in real time. The negotiations are being discussed in real time, the timelines are running simultaneously. The question is no longer whether tensions exist. The question is whether diplomacy can move faster than preparation for confrontation, or whether the region is locking itself into a long-term standoff that future leaders will struggle to unwind.